Of March 1969, Beatle Paul McCartney and Linda Eastman leave Paul's London home to get married. After a short ceremony, Paul and Linda came out of the Marylebone Registry Office as man and wife, fighting their way through a scrum of press photographers and frantic teeny bopper fans. A new chapter was beginning in Paul's life, and an era was closing for the Beatles. Paul James McCartney was born in the port of Liverpool on the 18th of June, 1942. He came from a working-class background. His mother was a nurse, his father was a cotton salesman and part-time jazz musician.
My dad and his father before him had been into music. His father was in like a brass band. He used to play called the E-flat bass, oompa. And my dad was in like a jazz band called Jim Mack's Jazz Band. And he used to play trumpet and piano till his teeth gave out and it was just piano.
When Paul was 14, his mother died of cancer. His father, Jim, brought up Paul and his younger brother, Michael, on his own.
It was very difficult at 14 because you're growing up and you're sort of getting your act together. I see it with my own kids. Around about 14, you get very conscious of what you were, you know. So it was a tough time to have something like as devastating as that happen. And I think I probably covered a lot of it up at the time, as you would, a 14-year-old boy. And that was one of the big, strong bonds between John and I. John Lennon, because a couple of years after that, his own mum was killed, so we kind of had a bond with it.
Another bond was to be rock and roll. Elvis was Paul's hero. Paul remembers that Elvis was the biggest kick. Every time I felt low, I'd just put on Elvis and I'd feel great. It was just magic. The teenage Paul ate the style of Britain's so-called teddy boys, rock and roll fanatics who wore draped jackets and sported extravagant hairstyles. But Paul's rebellion was only skin deep. A deep-dyed rebel was John Lennon, whose skiffle band, the Quarrymen, Paul McCartney joined when he was 15.
He was like a couple of years older than me. He was 1.5 years older than me. So I was a bit kind of, innocent then. I was 14. I hadn't seen a lot of life. And, well, not the kind of life we're talking about. Anyway, and he was into drinking a bit, so he had a couple of beers, being real. And he was leaning over. I remember thinking, gosh, he was all a bit smelly and clear.
In August 1960, Paul, John and George Harrison began the musical journey which gave birth to the Beatles. They made the first of 5 trips to Hamburg to serve a grueling but rewarding apprenticeship in the nightclubs of the German port. Hamburg was a bigger, tougher version of Liverpool. Every night the Beatles played up to 6 45-minute sessions. Back in Liverpool, the Beatles made their debut at the Cavern Club early in 1961. By September 1962, they had been joined by drummer Ringo Starr, but the creative heart of the band was the songwriting team of John and Paul. Within 18 months, the Beatles were to become a worldwide phenomenon. Beatlemania had broken out. The Times newspaper described John and Paul as the outstanding composers of 1963. In March 1964, the Beatles began filming their first movie, A Hard Day's Night. Director Richard Lester captured the hysteria generated by Beatlemania and contrasted it with the band's natural freewheeling charm. The Beatles were the biggest show in town. They conquered America, and in August 1965, they played before 56,000 frantic fans at New York's Shea Stadium. You couldn't hear the music over the din. Atmosphere was everything. The Beatles had conquered the world. Linda Eastman was born into a prosperous Jewish family on the 24th of September 1941. She was brought up in the well-to-do New York suburb of Scarsdale. Her father Lee had made a fortune as an entertainment lawyer. Sometimes she played truant from school to see shows at the Paramount Theatre in Brooklyn. Linda recalled that the Paramount would stage 20 acts over a 24-hour period. Alan Freed was the DJ. Bobby Darin was often the MC. At the Paramount, Linda saw Chuck Berry for the first time singing School Days. Linda attended Scarsdale High and the Sarah Lawrence College. After the death of her mother, Louise, in a plane crash, Linda escaped to the Southwest and married geology student Melvin C. In December 1963, she had her first child, Heather, but the marriage lasted less than a year. In Tucson, Arizona, Linda joined a photography class.
Photography really happened when I was living in Arizona, and a friend of mine wanted to go to this art class at the Tucson Art Center. And it was in the evenings, and she said, please come along with me, I really want to go. I said, no way. She said, well, I won't go if you don't come, so come. Anyway, I went, and I thought it would be teaching you what a camera was and everything, and it wasn't. It was looking at photographs, like Walker Evans and Dorothy Lang, Ansel Adams, I remember, really great photographers.
The class tutor was Hazel Archer. Linda had discovered a new world.
I told her I recognized something, that she really had an eye, and it was really important that she keep on with that kind of energy.
Eventually, Linda moved back to New York. She was still uncertain about her future. She landed a job as an editorial assistant at an upmarket glossy magazine, Town and Country, which was about to feature another British rock band, the Rolling Stones. Linda takes up the story.
When the Rolling Stones were trying to get publicity for themselves when they were touring over here, they sent Town and Country an invitation, which I opened and put in my drawer. I thought, well, I'll go to that one.
The Stones were planning a boat trip on the Hudson. Linda arrived on the quayside, miniskirted and Pentax in hand. Her initiative was rewarded. The pictures she took that day launched her career as a photographer. Soon, Linda's work was to become a staple of the magazine Rolling Stone. Her subjects would include the Lovin' Spoonful, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, and the Beatles. Linda met Paul McCartney for the first time in 1966, during the Beatles' third tour of the States. In May 1967, she made her first trip to London as a professional photographer. It was a heady period, the height of swinging London. Linda was soon to meet Paul McCartney again. The bassist of the Animals, Chas Chandler, took Linda to a fashionable Soho club, the Bag o' Nails. Paul was there with a group of friends. Linda renewed her acquaintance with Paul and then joined his party as they moved on to another trendy club, the Speakeasy. Linda was eager to photograph the Beatles. She was helped by their manager, Brian Epstein.
And the Beatles I wanted to photograph as well. So I took my portfolio over to Hilly House, their office, and Brian Epstein's assistant said, fine, will you leave your portfolio and we'll get back to you. So after about 2 or 3 days, he got back to me saying, oh, Brian loved your photographs, and yes, you may photograph the Beatles. They're releasing an album called Sgt. Pepper, and they're doing a press thing at Brian's house, and you can be one of the photographers. And by the way, Brian loved your picture of Brian Jones and one of the ones of Keith Moon, and he'd like to buy them. I said, oh, you can have them. You know, so that's how that happened as well. I got to photograph the Beatles.
Linda got her pictures of the Fab Four, but as she later confessed, she had now set her cap at Paul McCartney. Linda returned to New York lovesick but empty-handed. Paul's longtime girlfriend was actress Jane Asher. Linda was not to see Paul again until May 1968, when, accompanied by John Lennon, he arrived in New York to publicize the newly formed Apple Corporation. Paul and Linda spent several days together in a friend's apartment. A month later, Paul was in Los Angeles and reunited with Linda. Within 2 months, he had asked her to share his life in London. Linda began a new life as Paul McCartney's lover. Linda was joined by her daughter Heather and married Paul in March 1969. Paul's legion of teenage female fans was outraged. Many were inconsolable. For a Beatle, marriage was not an option. The fans owned them. Paul's marriage to Linda had also coincided with a critical point in his relationship with John Lennon. For a week later, John married Yoko Ono. He and Paul had been finding their personal and professional relationships increasingly difficult. Yoko and Linda moved in to fill the space left by the two men's growing estrangement. Paul was philosophical about his change of direction.
We'd actually done a lot before we met each other. Each of us had got a lot of career out of the way, and so we weren't searching for the Holy Grail. We'd met lots of people. We'd both had sort of lots of boyfriend, girlfriends. So at the age of about, I don't know, 27 or 28, when we married, we were then able to sort of say, yeah, okay, well, maybe we could get married now.
Paul's marriage acted as a solvent on the weakening ties which bound the Beatles together as a group. The Beatles were never the uncomplicated mop-tops celebrated in the 1968 cartoon Yellow Submarine. The reality was more complex. The fans wanted the Beatles to stay the same. But the Beatles had been constantly changing since the day they'd formed the band. The formation of Apple marked the beginning of the end of the Beatles. The group could not contain the new lives Paul and John wanted to lead. In December 1970, Paul McCartney began proceedings in the British High Court to end the partnership of the Beatles. After 10 fabulous years, John, Paul, George and Ringo were about to become history. For Paul, it was a devastating blow. The all-encompassing life of a Beatle was now over. But Linda was there to help him launch a solo career. In the autumn of 1971, Paul and Linda had their first child, Stella, and formed a band, Wings, with Linda on keyboard.
Yeah, the main pressure originally was just when I'd originally just split with the Beatles and they'd split up. The original thing there, it was just tough for a couple of years to even think of if we could even dare to try and do anything again, you know, or whether you just had to hang up your boots and retire gracefully to Boot Hill.
Linda weathered skepticism about her lack of musical training, and in 1977, Wings wrote a piece of pop history with Mull of Kintyre.
Yeah, well, when we first put it out, it was one of those things that the climate of records was very kind of punk, and that was all just coming in, you know. So I thought, well, you know, this is either going to flop terribly, and everyone's going to say it's just too old-fashioned and people don't want that kind of thing anymore, or it's going to do all right, but I never thought it would do as well as it did.
But turbulence accompanied Wings' progress as the band launched a succession of worldwide tours. In August 1972, police in Sweden intercepted a parcel of cannabis intended for Paul and Linda, who were given a £1,000 fine. It was the first in a string of drugs-related incidents. In 1980, at the start of a Wings tour of Japan, customs officials at Tokyo Airport found marijuana in one of Linda's bags. Paul was held in custody for 9 days. The tour was abandoned and marked the beginning of the end for Wings. Paul later told the press that he and Linda intended to give up smoking marijuana. Later, Paul reflected on the implications for his growing family.
Well, that's not easy, obviously, because on the one hand, you want to say to them, stay clean, don't do anything, just stay healthy and enjoy your life, which I think is the number one, aim. I do advise them to do that. But as you say, it's a bit hypocritical when I'm in clink somewhere,
There was a greater shock in store. On the 8th of December 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed in the lobby of the Dakota Building in New York, where he lived with Yoko. He was 40 years old. Caught off his guard by a persistent reporter, Paul had let slip the remark that John's death was a drag man. He was immediately branded heartless and uncaring. Yoko Ono claimed that Paul had hurt John more than any other person. The truth was more complicated. John and Paul had always been in competition. It fueled their creative fires. But John's death brought to an end speculation that the Beatles would ever get together again. Paul was now free as an individual. Paul continued to go his own way. 1984 saw the release of a film developed by him, Give My Regards to Broad Street. The movie received a mixed reception. Musicians are not always the best filmmakers. A year later, Paul was back to doing what he loved best, performing live on stage in the rousing finale to the Live Aid concert. He had perhaps never rescaled the heights he had climbed with the Beatles, but Paul McCartney was still generating music. And not all of it was rock music. At the beginning of the 1990s, Paul revisited the Liverpool of his childhood and youth. To mark its 150th anniversary in 1991, the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic commissioned the Liverpool Oratorio. The oratorio was performed for the first time in Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral. It marked another staging post in the journey from Hamburg and the Cavern Club. Later, the oratorio and the Philharmonic embarked on a world tour. Linda had been busy too. After Wings, she resumed her career as a photographer. She had never lost her instinct for looking. There were books and exhibitions celebrating her work. In 1987, Women in Photography voted Linda U.S. Photographer of the Year. Another of Linda's passions was soon to come to the fore. She was a noted horsewoman and a passionate vegetarian. Not content with converting her family, she took on the world.
I think we should care more about each other. I think we should think about what we eat and how we live. And maybe I'm a dreamer, but I think we should do it. So hence why I've done Linda's Kitchen, to help people who want to help the planet, want to help themselves, want to help the world, to go veggie.
Linda's frozen vegetarian meals became an international success. In 1996, Paul fulfilled a dream when he opened the Liverpool Institute of the Performing Arts. It was an emotional occasion.
Obviously, one of my great feelings now is how proud my mum and dad would have been if they could have been here. But I won't get into that because I'll start crying.
Paul had invested over £1 million of his own money in the Institute, which offered 200 students courses in the art of starting up and surviving in show business. As he coasted into middle age, more honours awaited Paul. The teenage rebel was about to become Sir Paul McCartney.
Love you, Beatles. Oh, yes, we do. We don't love anyone as much as you.
He's waited long enough for it. It's a really great day for every Beatles fan.
In March 1997, Paul McCartney was knighted at Buckingham Palace. He told the press,
Proud to be British, wonderful day, and it's a long way from a little terrace in Liverpool.
he was asked what his fellow Beatles thought of him.
They make fun of me. They call me Your Holiness.
But tragically, Linda could not share Paul's joy. For she was now gravely ill with cancer. Paul and Linda did not tell the media or even close friends of the gravity of her illness. Linda fought her battle with illness within a loving and supportive family. She died at the age of 56 on the 17th of April, 1998. In June 1998, there was a memorial service for Linda at the Church of St. Martin in the Fields in London. Paul told the press, "I am privileged to have been Linda's lover for 30 years. And in all that time, except for one enforced absence, we have never spent a single night apart. When people asked why, we would say, what for?" The Beatles industry rolled on like a river. Paul's childhood home at number 20 Forth Lynn Road, Allerton, is now a monument cared for by the British National Trust. In these modest surroundings, the music that inspired a generation was born. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership was forged. And the door opened to a world of fame and fortune. Years later, Linda's great gift to Paul was to give him a close family life that warmed and sustained him. They were hugely wealthy, but lived modestly. Linda ensured that the McCartneys always kept their feet on the ground. And she lived long enough to celebrate the success of her fashion designer daughter, Stella. She gave Paul what he prized most, a life beyond the Beatles.